You're listening to the Greeks Gridiron. Now here's your host, Ethan Hristodoulou.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Greeks Gridiron. I am Ethan Hristodoulou, and today on this February 28th, 2025, last day of the month, the NFL Combine is in full swing. I don't want to say officially kicked off with drills yesterday because there were punters and kickers doing work the day prior, but the NFL is now at least acknowledging what's going on the football field in Lucas Oil Stadium, with linebackers and defensive linemen taking the stage yesterday to go through skill drills, to go through the physical measurements, and of course all of the testing and whatnot. There's a lot going on right now in Indy, and beyond what's happening on the field over there for a lot of these young and up-and-coming future potential stars of the NFL, there's news that we've got to get into. Myles Garrett looking to force his way out of Cleveland. Trey Smith getting tagged by Kansas City. We're going to get into that a little bit and some of the consequences of it. We're going to talk some Combine Standouts and somebody who really jumped off the screen for not even just myself, but I think everyone. And then, of course, Matthew Stafford and the situation that is currently brewing over there. There's a lot to get into, a lot to discuss, so I want to hear from you all. Fire away in that comment section down below. Let me hear your thoughts on everything we're discussing today. Bit of a format change for the show, yes, but there is purpose behind it. This is a style and approach I've been wanting to take for a while, so if you're here for this episode, this is the debut of this bit of a format change. Now, that being said, what brought y'all here to begin with? Myles Garrett and the Cleveland Browns are essentially butting heads to no end right now, and it seems like we are heading for an extremely messy divorce over there in Cleveland. Myles Garrett wants out, and I don't think he could have made it any clearer that he wants to get out of there at this point here. And there's a lot that's being said from both sides right now currently as Myles Garrett tries to force his way out of Cleveland. And it has been clear for some time now with that initial tweet that he first put out demanding a trade, making a statement for everyone to see. It is very public. It is very out in the open. But we have this that I do want to discuss that came out yesterday. Ari Meirov tweeting out on X, Browns defensive end Myles Garrett, slamming the door essentially here, is unwilling to negotiate a contract extension with the organization as his agents have apparently slammed the door shut on any discussions per Mary Kay Cabot. Garrett remains firm. He no longer wants to be in Cleveland. And I've got to say, I don't really think I can blame him for wanting to get out of Cleveland. For you Cleveland Browns fans, I genuinely feel for you because you are in a literal lose-lose-lose situation. There is no way out of possibly winning in the current spot that you are with the situation at quarterback, the team taking a major step back this past season, and now you have your star player, one of the very few bright spots that has consistently shined in Cleveland for you, is banging the table and making it abundantly clear to the point where he's just locking out the brass from Cleveland and completely saying, I want no interest in being here. There is no dollar amount that you can give me that is going to change my mind. It's getting pretty ugly in Cleveland. Now, Ari Meirov did state Mary Kay Cabot was the one who had the article on this, so I did want to go check it out, see what was in there, if there was anything maybe new. There wasn't necessarily a ton of nuggets, but it was a really nice summary of just kind of the current situation that's in, and I think one quote that I pulled from it here that came from Browns GM Andrew Berry is really telling on just the ugliness of this situation and where we are, and verbatim, the quote, I wouldn't really touch on any conversations that I have with other teams, just respectfully. I don't think that's appropriate just for current and future business, but it's irrelevant to the situation because we're not interested in trading Myles. But then on the flip side, you have something directly from Myles Garrett himself when discussing forcing a trade with the Cleveland Browns. Very short, very pointed, very, very obvious what he wants to do. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. In my eyes, the way this current situation has laid itself out to this point here, I don't really know how they mend this bridge. Yes, Myles Garrett is contractually obligated to the Cleveland Browns this season. He does have to be there. That being said, you do not want to be looked at as an organization that is currently in the situation that they are already in right now, as a team that's also willing to hold players hostage when they are very clearly wanting out. And again, I get it. He is contractually obligated to Cleveland. But if there's one thing the Browns could probably do to try and make good of what has been just a litany of missteps over the last, I would say, 3-4 years now for this Browns organization, it might be trying to find a way to move on from Myles Garrett. Now, the one thing that is really complicating this whole situation, Deshaun Watson's contract being one of them and all the money they owe him there, but the other being also the amount of money that the Browns would have to eat if they were to decide to go ahead and move on from Myles Garrett. Now, just looking at the contract numbers I pulled from Spotrac here, I just did a little bit of toying with the contract to see what is the realistic possibility here. How do you go about trading Myles Garrett, and also when do you go about trading Myles Garrett that makes the most sense? The salary cap is ballooning. It is going up, and it is going up, and it is going up year over year. I believe it has jumped $55 million in the last couple of years now, if I'm not mistaken. It jumped 31 last year and 24 this year, 25 this year now. So the salary cap is going up. You can eat a lot of this dead money, but in the situation that you have going on with Deshaun Watson and his contract, I don't really know if you decide to trade Myles Garrett prior to June 1st, eating $75 million in dead cap for the 2025 season is going to be in any way, shape, or form conducive of allowing you to build any sort of even slightly competitive roster. If you're trading away Myles Garrett and eating all that money, you're already punting on the season, and Myles Garrett is even letting you know that his desire to win now does not necessarily align with the Browns' current plans in the short term. Myles Garrett wants to win this year, and it sounds like the Browns are telling him that's just not the situation we're in right now. And so when you look at what the potential of a post-June 1st trade could look like, $18.5 million or so in 2025 in dead cap, and then you have about $56.5 million in 2026. The numbers obviously still very large, but you're not completely obliterating your team with $75 million this year. You're taking nearly 20 and then dishing out the other 55.5 or so over the next year, where the salary cap is again going to jump. And on top of that, you're also going to be 1 year further removed through this contract that you're dealing with Deshaun Watson. In my eyes right now, the way this current situation stands, I do think that there is a reality where Myles Garrett is traded. I feel like both sides are just trying to jockey for position at this current moment here, but if there is an offer that the Browns just simply can't refuse that comes up, I don't really see how you say no, because this team does need kind of a massive reset, and it's not going to happen until you can get Deshaun Watson out of the building and that contract out of your hair, which unfortunately, the way it is structured, you're stuck with it for 2 more years. So I would say do what you can to move Myles Garrett now. There is going to be a team that has a ton of cap space that is probably more than willing to bring him on. A team like maybe the New England Patriots, just off the top of my head, with nearly $130 million to work with. There are some other teams that I'm sure would be more than interested as well, but just to give you an idea, if you wanted to maybe think of an Arizona Cardinals team, they're not necessarily win now, so maybe that's not something Myles Garrett wants to go do. The Patriots, with a new coaching structure and the addition of Myles Garrett and a bunch of other key pieces being brought in this offseason, could at least be in somewhat contention, and I would say are in a better position than the Browns are at this current moment. So maybe you can sell him on that. Maybe if a team like, I guess, the Eagles and the salary cap magic, they could work. We're willing to move on from Josh Sweat and a guy like Milton Williams, who seems like he's going to make some good money. Maybe they make a big trade for him to keep their defense humming the way it is, and being able to bring a guy like Myles Garrett, in my eyes, is not a bad swap for someone like Josh Sweat and Williams, who are both very productive themselves this year in Philadelphia. Don't get me wrong. Great guys, but they're not Myles Garrett. So there is options to move him around the league. It's just going to be, is the compensation right? But in my eyes, this is going to get really messy, and Cleveland can't really afford to have something like this going on top of what has already been like a disastrous handling of this roster as a whole from the organization. So I genuinely hope that the Browns are at least willing to move on from Myles Garrett. It may end up being sooner, or not sooner. It might be later rather than sooner. Like, it really seems like if they can hang on till after June 1st, you have a far more realistic window to move on from him and it not really kill you in 2025. So maybe this ends up being ugly. We go past the draft and he's still there and then he gets moved. That might be a possibility. I don't work for the Cleveland Browns, but I do think that just the way this is shaping up, I have a hard time believing that there's a real dollar amount that the Browns are able to commit to him right now that's going to make him want to stick around, when it seems like championships and legacy is what he cares about more than anything at this current point. Moving off from the defensive side of the trenches to the offensive side of the trenches, though, we are going to talk about some Trey Smith getting franchise tagged by his Kansas City Chiefs. Now, this is one of those things that I would say a lot of people were probably not anticipating outside of Kansas City. So the deal, pretty big if you ask me. Franchise tagged to the tune of $23.4 million is Ian Rappaport with a tweet here. Chiefs are planning to franchise tag star guard Trey Smith, sources say. An intriguing move as KC keeps one of its best players for $23.4 million on a one-year fully guaranteed deal. Now, of course, there is always the option to go ahead and tag him now, work out a long-term deal. You have the time to do that. But there are teams like the Patriots, like we mentioned earlier, teams like the Chicago Bears, or maybe even some lesser discussed teams, but teams that I honestly don't think would be too upset with going after a guy like Trey Smith's caliber, maybe like the Arizona Cardinals or a Houston Texans team whose offensive line was severely struggling this past season, and in my eyes is a big reason why they wound up falling flat late in the season here. It's not all doom and gloom for the teams that were maybe hoping to go after Trey Smith. While initially it feels like a big, shot to the gut, you can go back to as recently as last offseason and you can find an example of this very same team, the Kansas City Chiefs, tying up a ton of money with a franchise tag on none other than cornerback L'Jarius Sneed. What ended up happening there? Well, tag Sneed, give it, like a few weeks at most, I think. Ultimately, you get yourself a nice trade and sign as Sneed went over to Tennessee. Kansas City recouped some compensation. All sides were happy when all was said and done. The way I see it right now, and you can say that there's the Patrick Mahomes contract is like this crazy thing that you can just it seems like you can move decimal points around and you can move years around here and there. And, you cross out a T and maybe you dot a different I. And next thing you know, there's all this cap space and you can pay all these guys. And there is something to be said about the offensive line struggles that we did see from Kansas City, especially in that Super Bowl. And maybe letting a guy like Trey Smith go is not necessarily of the utmost importance, but at $23.5 million for one singular season, that AAV is higher than anyone in the league right now. Eagles' Landon Dickerson leads guards with AAV at this current moment, or at least prior to this moment here, of at $21 million a year. So now you're looking at a jump of nearly $2.5 million more than the next guy behind you for a offensive guard. I don't necessarily know if that's in the best interest for the Chiefs monetarily, because they need to work on their tackles. Yes, Trey Smith has been big for them on the interior there, but tying up that much money when you probably need to move on from Jawan Taylor, and I don't really know if left tackle is going to be solved as well, and we're still trying to figure out exactly what Kingsley Suamataia is over there. So this is a team that needs to work on the offensive line a bit, and I don't know if tying up $250 million is necessarily the right way to do it. Now, if you look at, for those of you that are maybe of a team that are hoping to sign somebody like Trey Smith, now signing him's off the table. You could always hope to see that your team trades for him, and then the question becomes, well, what does that trade compensation be? That does get a little bit tricky because the contract that he's going to get is going to be massive. I would expect that his AAV is going to be something in the ballpark of what that franchise tag is going to be for this year. It might be a little bit less because the highest currently is $21 million with, again, Landon Dickerson from Philadelphia. But the way I see it, you're going to have to be okay with your team not only giving up a ton of money now, but also giving up trade compensation and a draft pick. I mean, you're probably looking at like a second or third rounder and then maybe something else included. And that just comes down to like, are you okay with your team giving up that much capital? Like, I understand it's an offensive guard, not the sexiest position in the world, but offensive line play and good offensive line play comes at a premium these days. And these guys just typically don't hit the open market when they're at this current stage of their career playing at the level that Trey Smith is. So that's where you just kind of have to turn around and look at the rest of the guys that are sitting on the free agency block. And I mean, it's not pretty. So James Daniels is out there coming off a torn Achilles. You have Patrick McCarry, who could potentially hit the market, considering the Ravens are also trying to figure out a way to pay left tackle Ronnie Stanley. You have a Tevin Jenkins, who has struggled to stay healthy, and even though he played a decent amount of games last year, there were games that he wasn't even finishing because of those injuries that he was battling with. You have an offensive guard in Will Hernandez, who dealt with a season-ending knee injury himself. You have a guy like maybe a Brandon Scherf coming from Jacksonville. He's 33 years old, though, and not getting any younger. There is someone like a Mekhi Becton who could potentially be a big piece to your offensive line, but the big question mark around him is he was struggling prior to getting to Philadelphia. He was kind of the last piece of that offensive line puzzle over there because they had basically everything from left tackle to right tackle, aside from the guard spot he played, filled out. And he wasn't necessarily at the level of play you got from him in Philadelphia prior to getting to Philadelphia. So do you want to take the gamble on a guy who, if you look at Spotrac's numbers, has him making north of $10 million per year based off how he did this year in Philadelphia? Are you willing to commit that kind of money there? So it's a lot of what ifs and injuries, and you know, this guy is good but this, and this guy is all right but that. So it's like this is a tough situation, but the opportunity is still there. At least I'll be curious to see what happens with Trey Smith. I've got to say, I did not anticipate a franchise tag on an offensive guard coming from the Kansas City Chiefs. And again, I understand some of the offensive line struggles and maybe wanting to try to keep that interior group of guys together because you now have the highest right guard in the NFL, or just offensive guard, I think, as a whole, if I'm not mistaken there, in Trey Smith. You're also paying Creed Humphrey, I believe, the highest AAV in the NFL as well. And then, of course, Joe Thuney's not making any sort of chump change himself. So you got a lot of money tied up to the interior of that offensive line with some tackle issues that you need addressing there. I do think there is a real likelihood that he gets traded on this franchise tag. It's not the first time that we would have seen Kansas City do it. So all hope is not lost. It's just a matter of, are you now okay with seeing your team not only give up a ton of dollars for him, but also maybe give up some draft compensation as well? But the good news is I don't think the draft comp is going to have to be that high, considering if Kansas City is still trying to move him, it's going to come down to, well, we have to pay him on top of giving you stuff. So the market value as far as trade comp's going to go is probably won't be as high, if that makes sense. Moving into the actual combine, though, we do have some combine discussion we need to get into here. It was a pretty interesting day nonetheless. There was a lot of conversation surrounding some big names. Mason Graham, who opted to sit out. You also had Abdul Carter, who is dealing with, this is something I've never heard of before either, a stress reaction in his foot. Like, I've heard of stress fractures and things like that, but a stress reaction in his foot. There was conversation on whether or not that he was going to need to get surgery on that and what that could all mean for him. I think he's going to be all right. I don't really think it's going to affect his draft stock. I don't really think he falls out of the top 4. Yeah, is it a bit of a concern? Maybe, but the talent is there. And when you look at the way this draft class is kind of shaping itself out, Abdul Carter is one of the 2 best guys in this draft class in a lot of people's eyes. And I would be hard-pressed to believe that a stress reaction, which, again, is a weird thing that I've just never heard of before, is what would hold him back from potentially being picked at like number 1 or number 2 or maybe number 3 if some wonky business happens at 1 and 2. Like, I just have a hard time seeing him making it past number 3, let alone number 4 if the Patriots get the opportunity to draft him. Like, that's as far as he's going, number 4. But who I really want to focus on here are some of the actual standouts. You had guys like Georgia's Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins, Nebraska's Ty Robinson, Boston College's Donovan Ezeraku come in, show up, and show out. There was a lot of really fun performances to look at going through this very, quote, air quotes here for those of you that might just be listening, air quotes on this one, first day of the Combine. Let's not forget that there were people kicking footballs the day prior, but first day of the Combine for drills and people doing things like vertical leaps and long jumps and not long jumps, broad jumps, wrong jumping. But yes, a lot of conversation around some guys, some important guys, putting up some good testing numbers. Jihad Campbell impressed a lot of people with what he did as well. But the person that I need to highlight here, because off the chart numbers here, and it was just crazy to see it all play out, we have got to talk Shamar Stewart's day, because he looked unbelievable here. And I'm going to shout out Math Bomb on X, also known as Kent Lee Platt, the guy, the creator behind what we all know as the relative athletic scores that have been going around the last few years on X and social media. If you look at the numbers here, coming from him himself, the man, the creator, go check out his work if you haven't already. Shamar Stewart, a defensive end prospect in the 2025 draft class. He scored an unofficial 9.99 RAS score out of a possible 10. This ranked number 3 out of 1,802 defensive end prospects, ranging from 1987 to the year 2025, in which we currently reside. Now, the splits obviously projected, times are unofficial, but you'll look at the numbers on there. This guy is a physical specimen, and that is maybe even potentially putting it lightly when you consider things like size and just who he is. It's pretty insane to see what he put together. When you look at the numbers, weighing in at a whopping 267 pounds, standing at 6'5". This is a big man who can run, who can jump. He's got explosiveness and just power in his legs. This guy is somebody that I think not only is flying up draft boards right now, but maybe have thrusted himself into first round conversation. Now, that is something that will be up for contention and up for debate between now and the actual draft. And of course, when the pro day comes around, that'll be something we all have to keep an eye on as well, because that'll be kind of like the icing on the cake, or maybe a nail in the coffin on that first round potential conversation here. And the reason I bring this up is because I saw a tweet from Tom Pelissero, or post, whatever you want to call it these days, but I saw something from him that I do want to mention here, because I thought it was an interesting piece of information here. Now, Tom Pelissero put this out saying on Monday that, I said on Monday that Shamar Stewart could put up Trayvon Walker type of numbers in Indianapolis. Walker, the number 1 overall pick in the 2022 draft, put up a also 9.99 relative athletic score. Today, Stewart obviously unofficially putting up a perfect 10, which then did get adjusted to that 9.99. Still unofficial, as the final numbers end up coming in a little bit later, but just an overall ridiculous athlete. And I think it's very interesting to go about highlighting this comparison here, because this is one of those situations where Abdul Carter is the guy, and then there's a lot of conversation about the guys behind him. But this is the time of year where the Combine happens. Guys in shorts and t-shirts tend to show off their physical abilities in ways that maybe some people weren't quite anticipating. And then all of a sudden they're flying up boards and they're in conversations that maybe you did not expect them to be in. And I want to take you back to that draft class between Trayvon Walker and, of course, Aiden Hutchinson. A lot of people looked at Aiden Hutchinson as the guy in that draft class. He was going to be the number 1 pick. There was the rumblings of what was going to happen with Trayvon Walker, but a lot of people looked at Aiden Hutchinson as that guy. Now, do I think that I'm going to sit here and say that, all right, well, maybe Shamar Stewart's going to fly up the boards now. He's going to be the number one pick and usurp Abdul Carter as the best edge rusher in this draft right now. Not necessarily, but I do think that the numbers just overall are rather jarring, even just down to what these guys measured in at and weighed in at in their respective combine numbers. You look at, again, like I mentioned, Shamar Stewart, 6'5", 267. You look at Trayvon Walker, 6'5", 272. Both of these guys putting up some of the best relative athletic scores of their position all time, dating back to 1987. I don't think we're in a situation where Shamar Stewart's going to all of a sudden usurp Abdul Carter, even with the injury conversation that we briefly touched on earlier. But I do think that this is one of those guys that is going to jump on a lot of people's boards because there are a fair amount of teams that are looking for that pass rush help on the edge. And after watching what happened in the Super Bowl this year, pass rushers, especially on the edge, have always come at a premium, and they're being paid top dollar for a reason because they disrupt an offensive-heavy league. But after what we saw in this year's Super Bowl, I think that pressure to find that guy is getting even higher, and teams are going to be even more willing to make a jump. And this is a situation right now where, again, Shamar Stewart, sure, maybe he didn't have the most productive collegiate career, 4.5 sacks, only 12 tackles for loss, but it's not like Trayvon Walker himself even had that productive of a career. Yeah, that final year at Georgia was great, don't get me wrong. 6 sacks, was on a championship winning team, but he only managed 9.5 sacks his entire collegiate career. Granted, maybe a little bit of less playing time. You're on a stacked Georgia roster. You're not getting in there as often until those final few years there. Maybe that's a part of the conversation as well, but it's not like Trayvon Walker had some ludicrous collegiate career himself. My point being, if you pair that raw size and athleticism of Shamar Stewart and you have yourself some great coaching, great leadership, a clear direction, and a great scheme fit, there is a very good chance that Shamar Stewart winds up being that next Trayvon Walker. And I'm not saying he gets picked number one, but do not be surprised if this is someone that's going off the board far earlier than anyone anticipated, because if there's one thing that has been abundantly clear through time, scouts, GMs, coaches, they love those physical freaks of nature, and Shamar Stewart is on that board in my eyes. Now, we do have one last thing we need to get into here before we wrap up the show, and that is going to be, of course, this what is basically borderline drama at this current point here. Matthew Stafford, what is going on in Los Angeles, and is he heading on over to Las Vegas? There was the reports that initially came out, and I genuinely cannot believe that this all went down the way it did, but we had reports start coming out from Jordan Schultz, not Montana, excuse me. I said that earlier today, too, to somebody. Tom Brady met with Matthew Stafford, or met up with Matthew Stafford, potentially on purpose, potentially on accident. Ian Rappaport saying it was not on purpose. Jordan Schultz, of course, saying it was on purpose. And if you have not seen the exchange or heard anything about it, you must be living under a rock, because how are you watching me talk about this right now, but you didn't hear about that? Whether it was on purpose or not, it led to a massive shouting match at Starbucks, and now we're left with the question of, is this a very real thing now? Matthew Stafford uprooting himself from Los Angeles and joining Tom Brady over in Las Vegas and trying to help lead the Raiders on a potential playoff push next year. Now, the Raiders roster is pretty good, and when you have a guy like Tom Brady who's won 7 Super Bowls making pitches to you about, listen, the team, the ownership, front office, they're all listening to me. I am basically doing what I did in New England and in Tampa Bay, and I'm trying to do the same thing here now. Come over to this side, and we can maybe win a championship together. Probably makes it a little bit easier to consider this. Now, we have that come out. Not really. It's not something that I'm sitting here going, all right, do I really buy into this? Like, is a chance meeting or a potential planned meeting of, an owner, and Matthew Stafford who, and I don't know why people were running with tampering. A lot of people seem to have missed the fact that the Rams gave Matthew Stafford permission to seek a trade and to find out what his value was in the market. And I genuinely can't believe how many people missed that, because it's not like it was a secret. Like, it was widely reported and people were just coming out of the woodwork saying tampering. It was never tampering. I don't know how people are on social media as often as they are and missed that. Like, it's crazy to me. But apparently now, as it stands with some reports coming out, there is a chance that Matthew Stafford to the Raiders isn't just a pipe dream, but is an actual reality here. So we have this that I'll show you. This is a tweet coming from U Stadium. The Raiders and quarterback Matthew Stafford have found common ground on parameters of a potential deal. Per Vinny Bonsignore, while no deal is imminent, it's up to the Rams to match or agree on compensation with Las Vegas. Now, typically, I would not be sharing something like this from an account like U Stadium. Now, that's not to discredit them or anything like that. It's just, for me, I want to pull things from people that are reporters in spaces that I typically can. The Adam Schefters, the Ian Rappaports, the Tom Pelisseros of the world. Like, those are the people that I'm following, those kinds of names, and those are the people that I'm pulling a lot of information from. However, the name Vinny Bonsignore came up in that post, and it rang a bell. I actually produced an interview with Vinny Bonsignore not too long ago for my actual day job, so I do know about him and I do know about his work. So when I saw his name, I said, all right, let me take a look into this a little bit more. There's an article about it. Let's see what's going on here. And I pulled some pretty interesting quotes from this article that honestly have me potentially buying into the Matthew Stafford to Los Angeles train now. So first one here, Stafford, 37, and the Rams are at an impasse right now on a new deal. He is under contract for 2 more years, but much of his compensation is not guaranteed. He is believed to be seeking a new deal that pays him $50 million per season with a substantial amount of guaranteed money. We'll stop there for a second because $50 million per year is a lot. Do I think it's a lot for Matthew Stafford, though? A Super Bowl winning quarterback and somebody who, once his offense was put back together with duct tape and was at least semi-healthy, came back to life and he looked really good. And he was one of the best quarterbacks under pressure and against the blitz, as he typically is year in and year out through the duration of his career. I don't think it's that out of the realm of, like, I don't think that's like an unfair deal to ask for in my eyes. $50 million per year with more guaranteed money, considering where the market is going and how we are approaching now $60 million per year. If the Rams or potentially the Raiders lock him up at that number, yeah, it's on the higher end, but he's not the highest paid quarterback in the NFL by any means. Like, there is a fair amount of guys that'll be sitting in front of him that are younger than him that are making far more money, and I understand that. They're younger, they're going to be around longer, that there's less of a risk with those younger quarterbacks per se. Obviously 37 years old at that point, you would expect a quarterback to start to be wearing down. So, there's more inherent risk in that. So I get that, but $50 million a year, not a lot to ask for. He goes on to say, whether Stafford gets what he wants remains to be seen, but NFL sources indicate that the Raiders and his camp have found common ground on what a potential new contract could look like. It's now about coming to terms with the Rams on a trade package. So none of this is officially out there yet, but he has a source within the NFL that is feeding this to him. And again, I like Vinny. I really like his work as well. Ever since I'm pretty new to his stuff, but once I learned about him and he ended up being a part of the show that I work again for my day job, I was excited to kind of see what he does. And now that I've kind of followed him a little bit more, this was a guy that as soon as his name popped up and we're talking Raiders, I was like, all right, so maybe, let me get a good read here. Now, the stuff that I really liked from this article that really started making me think, okay, like, this is very real, and I almost wouldn't be shocked to see the Raiders try to pull a trigger like this, is when he started getting into what the potential trade compensation would look like. Now, Pete Carroll and Spytek have consistently mentioned, and this is again from the article, the need to support their quarterback with a strong running game. Obviously, that was something that the Raiders were horrendous at last season. They were not able to run the football. Losing Josh Jacobs essentially killed their running game. That being said, he goes on to say, so Boise State running back Ashton Jeanty could be an attractive option at number 6, and I absolutely agree. I don't think that the Raiders' offensive line is necessarily the best in the NFL. I also don't think they're the worst. They're one of those offensive lines that I put like somewhere in the middle of the pack. And if you were able to add like one more piece to it to really get it to where it needs to be, if you have a Genty in the backfield paired with Matthew Stafford and Jacoby Myers and Brock Bowers as a duo, not bad by any means. I think you need one more legitimate wide receiver. And that is also something that gets mentioned as he goes on to say, the Raiders could also, instead of going after Genty, and we could kind of spin around what you could do if you don't go for Genty and you do this instead, if Arizona wide receiver Tatori McMillan falls, they could beef up the passing game that way. Either way, they want to keep the number 6 pick at all costs. So you don't want to see the Raiders trading the number 6 pick. I don't think the Raiders want to trade the number 6 pick, and I honestly don't even want to see them trade the number 6 pick. I want to see them be able to move some other picks around if need be to help build a unit around Matthew Stafford if they're going to go after him. And then he goes on to say, and this is where I kind of was like, okay, this is a trade that I think I could get down for. Rams could counter by asking, if they get told hard no on the number 6 overall pick, they could counter by asking for the Raiders' second round pick this year and their 2026 first round pick, so the one that they have next year. Is that too rich for Stafford? Could the Raiders maybe talk the Rams down to second round picks this year and 2026 rather than having to give up firsts? I genuinely believe that at this stage in Matthew Stafford's career, and yeah, they gave up a pretty decent amount to get him, if you were able to talk them into 2 second-round picks, that's not bad. The problem is that the Rams need to have a legitimate option at quarterback available to them, and that's where things get tricky. In my eyes, if you're the Raiders, number 6 overall pick is unfortunately a non-starter. It probably ends up being something along the lines of like a second this year and maybe that first next year, or maybe 2 seconds, a second this year, a second next year, and then like something thrown out to really sweeten the deal for them here. Because at the end of the day, we're talking the Rams moving on from their franchise quarterback. And if that's the case, then maybe they're targeting Sam Darnold or something like that. Maybe that's their option, somebody else in free agency that they'd go after. Sean McVay being the offensive mastermind he is, I would assume that he believes in himself enough to be able to bring somebody else in and have the same success like a Sam Darnold that Kevin O'Connell had with him in Minnesota. Or maybe he thinks, the Rams could find a way to rip Kirk Cousins and that monster of a contract out of Atlanta. I don't know. There's options on the table, though, for the Rams if they were to opt to move on from Matthew Stafford. And I'm really starting to like the idea of if you can retain that number 6 pick and you go and get Matthew Stafford and you get, again, another wide receiver or an Ashton Genty, or in this realm, if we're talking trades and we want to really beef up this offense in Las Vegas, how about this one? At number 6, you get Ted McMillan if you really like him there, or maybe if there's some way you can trade back and then draft them. But I think 6, you're starting to push it with Ted being the best wide receiver in this draft class, at least what a lot of people seem to think. You get Ted at number 6, and then you either pray and hope. Well, if you don't have your second round pick, then this is probably not possible. You have to find a way to trade your way back up into maybe trying to land a guy like Omarion Hampton or something like that at a UNC. Like, there are options. There are options there. There's maybe some free agent potentials that you could go after as well. But in my eyes, if you can get a receiver and a running back plus trading for Matthew Stafford, now you're starting to really cook with gas in Las Vegas. So it sounds like we're going to get an answer, and Ian Rappaport said as much on the Insiders last night that there is a realistic possibility, and it seems more likely than not at this stage based off the way he reported it, that we're going to have a final answer on where Matthew Stafford ends up by the end of this combine. And I'm starting to think there's a very real chance he's going to be a Las Vegas Raider. I don't know how you Raiders fans feel about that. I would love to hear in the comments down below what you all think about that. It's a pretty exciting prospect to me in my eyes. I would love to see him in the black and silver, though. I think that would be a lot of fun. It'd be great for the Raiders organization, and it would be a clear step in the right direction for a franchise that has kind of been sputtering the last handful of years. And it's also clear to me that they're all more than willing to listen to what Tom Brady has to say and really take into account what he was able to do with 2 other franchises. And it was very clear by the time that things ended in New England and when he went into Tampa Bay, a lot of what was going on, the culture building and being able to, lead these teams the way he did, a lot of that had to do with him, not necessarily other people involved. Like, I still give a ton of credit to Bill Belichick, but he was getting players to come just because he was there. And if you have Tom Brady in your ownership group at this stage, if there was a guy that could help lure you some big ticket people into Las Vegas, I would have to believe it's Tom Brady. And it sounds like he's laying some legitimate groundwork, and the Raiders are more than willing to pay something along the lines of what Matthew Stafford wants. Stafford as a Raider, I think I'm in on it. I really think, the more I talk about it, the more I'm starting to like it. And I really like Matthew Stafford in Los Angeles, but the more I say it out loud, the more I'm really starting to like the idea of Stafford in Las Vegas. So Raiders fans, let me know what you think in the comment section down below. But that all being said, that is it from me to you. We're about 40 minutes and some change in. Like I said, if you made it to the end of this, first of all, I greatly appreciate it. But this is a bit of a format change for me. This is probably the style of what I'll be doing going forward. I don't want to say struggling, but I was just very much unsure of how I wanted to attack this offseason and how I wanted to go about stuff for my show throughout the duration of the offseason and even just going forward in the future. And I had a lot of fun putting this together the way I did, and I have some more ideas down the pipeline. This was obviously pilot of this style. So if you enjoyed this version of the Greeks Gridiron, let me know in the comment section. For those of you that are always around, always watching, always listening, I would love to hear from you all. But again, if you made it to the end, I greatly appreciate it, and I will see you all next time. Have a good one.